Few video game franchises can claim to be as prolific as the Pokémon franchise. Pokémon got its start on February 27, 1996 with the Japanese release of Pokémon Red and Green for the Nintendo Game Boy system. Pokémon games have always featured a simple but satisfying premise. As the player, you are placed in the role of an ambiguously aged teen, tasked with collecting and training an ever-expanding roster of unique monsters. The cycle was beautiful in its execution, with difficulty seeming to follow a near-perfect curve. Rarely, if ever, were you presented with a challenge that seemed too impossible, nor were you presented with challenges that seemed too easy. Generally, in order to collect new monsters, you'd need to move from area to area. To this end, you'd need to train your existing monsters to an appropriate level. Only then would you be able to effectively take on the gym leader of the area you're currently located. Upon defeat, the gym leader would grant you a gym badge, which essentially but indirectly allows you passage to the next area. If there's anything I could say, the beauty of Pokémon's design was its cohesiveness and simplicity, yet somehow, it managed to offer a deep and meaningful experience to those willing to invest more time. As a child, I actually first recall hearing about Pokémon from Nintendo Power far before it had made its way to the United States. Never did I realize how big of a franchise Pokémon was poised to become. And then, it hit. For me, it started with the Game Boy game, then the television series, then the figurines, then the trading cards, then more games, and the list goes on and on and on. I, like many children at the time, was completely swept up in what I'd like to call Poke Fever. Fast forward to 2016, I've unfortunately found myself on the opposite end of the spectrum. Sadly, I'm in a state of slight Poke fatigue. I mean, don't get me wrong, the games are still well made, but I feel by the nature of their design, they are very samey. And for some, this isn't a problem. For me, however, I can sum up my feelings in about one word. Meh. Anyways, imagine my surprise when I discover there's a game coming out soon that promises to break completely away from the traditional mold in the best way possible. The premise of this new game is to allow you to live out the fantasy of catching Pokémon in the real world. But there's a catch, isn't there always? It's on mobile platforms, as a free-to-play game. Full disclaimer, I'm not really what you'd call a mobile gamer. I just don't see the appeal. Mobile games come off as too limited and boring to hold my attention for too long. That'd probably be because many of them encourage you to play in short bursts as opposed to long sessions. I find it difficult to gel with that sort of structure, preferring to do my gaming in larger chunks. That being said, I eventually decided to give this specific game, called Pokémon Go, a try. Because honestly, I highly doubt there's anyone out there who got swept up in Poke Fever who wouldn't like the idea of catching Pokémon in real life. Pokémon Go begins rather unceremoniously when compared to its console roots. The theme song's there and the dialogue's mostly there, but I feel like it's missing animation and life. Thankfully, this is a very minor point in the game, and its significance is probably reduced because this game isn't strictly story-driven like its handheld counterparts. You're almost immediately prompted to create a character, something that to my knowledge is unexplored in the mainline titles, I might add. Unfortunately, I found the character creation to be woefully inadequate. There's really nothing to make your avatar stick out in a crowd. Thankfully, this is mostly a non-issue since Pokémon Go doesn't put much emphasis on your avatar. It makes it clear that you're the trainer, and not the avatar you've created to represent you on the map. But anyways, immediately after creating your avatar, you're told that there are Pokémon nearby. This serves as a parallel to the original games, wherein you're allowed to select a starter Pokémon. Since it's paralleling the first generation of games, your starter choice is limited to any of the following: Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle. While I don't have footage of it, it's apparently possible to capture Pikachu as your starter instead, which is a reference to Pokémon Yellow, itself a reference to the Pokémon anime. It's not explained at all which Pokémon you should probably choose to be your starter, but the general consensus is that it doesn't matter tremendously. For most people though, Bulbasaur and Squirtle will end up being a tiny bit easier to find than Charmander or Pikachu. Combining my two previous thoughts, Pokémon Go definitely feels a bit more real-world than previous titles. You're given no obvious goal to work towards and there's little hand-holding, if at all. Though it is worth noting that there's a wealth of tools and information online for those budding Pokémon Go masters out there. But I'm trying to review this title as it's presented to me, and as such I tried to reference such materials minimally. Because of this, there are multiple ways to play the game. Say for example you're a grandparent and you have no interest in battling your captured creatures, just collecting them with your grandchild. That's a perfectly acceptable way to play and you're still getting a fairly whole experience. On the flip side, if you're a hardcore trainer, you might find it more fun to train your Pokémon for gym battles, wherein you fight against rival teams of players to control virtual representations of real-life locations, referred to as gyms. Personally, I have only spent about enough time to get a general feel for the game. I've only dipped my toes into gym battling, and in fact in my first gym battle, I was absolutely and utterly destroyed by the opponent's Pokémon. For this reason, I could see gym training being a much more involved and thus hardcore part of the game. That being said, hunting for Pokémon is thrilling enough in its own right. Capturing Pokémon has been considerably condensed, and while that was originally a turnoff for me, I've actually come to find that it is surprisingly deeper than it appears on the surface. I'll spare you the details, but basically you hold a lot more control over the capture of a Pokémon than just whether or not you hit the creature. Let me also add that there's little more thrilling in this game than accidentally stumbling upon a rare Pokémon that happens to be hanging around your immediate vicinity. The problem with that is, good luck actually finding it if it's not currently visible on your screen. As with any internet-based software, bugs and server problems will happen. Needless to say, Pokémon Go is no exception. In fact, because of the overwhelming response, I'd argue it's had some of the worst issues I've seen in an online-based game, mainly because some of them just make no sense. To be fair though, a number of these issues are likely temporary and may subside as the initial rush dies down, but some others seem to be odd oversights or bizarre programming. For example, this game is very particular about your network connection. As I was hunting in my local park, there was a part of my route where I consistently lose 3G signal, but can maintain GPS and edge. Nonetheless, like clockwork, catching Pokemon and accessing Pokestops in that area is an exercise in discouraging frustration. One of the most frustrating moments I can think of occurred the first day I actually played Pokemon Go. I was adamantly chasing down an Eevee and I began to approach a large church. As it turns out, it was actually a Pokestop. Church was letting out and I didn't want to interrupt the flow of traffic coming from the parking lot. I parked my bike nearby on the sidewalk, sat on a bench and started taking a drink of water, hoping to covertly capture the Pokestop while refreshing. Unfortunately, I had no such luck. In reflection, I realize now I must have been quite an awkward spectacle as I slowly tried to creep closer while also avoiding the path of cars. I had first made my way to the back of the church, then the side where the church's sign is, but neither was close enough for the game's finicky detection. My game of musical chairs wouldn't find its end until I literally was at the church's front door. Also, that Eevee I was hunting, never found it. Not that I'd know if it was even close, because as of now, the step counter is currently broken. These problems may all be related to internet or GPS latency, so I'm willing to forgive them despite being admittedly frustrating. But these next few I feel are just poor design choices. For starters, the game is completely inactive whenever it's backgrounded. To keep it running is to keep it active in your pocket, only to find it's dialing an acquaintance you haven't spoke with in years. Which is exactly what happened to me. It's equally frustrating when you realize you somehow accidentally hit the power button, only to find the game now has to completely reboot. Combined with the aforementioned server issues, it can be extremely frustrating to be accidentally logged out during peak game hours. I actually had this problem reoccur far too many times just because I switched to my screen recording app and back. Keep in mind that Pokemon only exist for round about 15 minutes in real life before they vanish. And that actually leads me to my final and biggest complaint. By design, Pokemon are capable of breaking free from a Pokeball you've thrown at it. That I don't mind. What I do mind is when your Pokeball becomes frozen after you've made a successful throw, or even worse, in one case I had a Pokeball freeze mid-throw, completely unmovable. Just couldn't throw any more Pokeballs at it. For me, this so-called zoom-in glitch, as dubbed by the community, seems to happen with greater frequency when attempting to catch a Pokemon I haven't captured before. There's a couple of proposed fixes, but they're very homemade, and due to the nature of the issue, none of them are preventative. Of the two most prolific methods, one works when it wants to, and the other I've literally had no success with at all, unless combined with the first method. Method 1 employs simply waiting until the Pokeball in the top left corner stops consistently spinning, then closing the app. Method 2 simply suggests you activate and deactivate airplane mode, forcing a reconnection. As I mentioned, Method 1 is dodgy at best and may or may not register the Pokemon as caught, but seems to favor giving me Pokemon I've already captured as opposed to ones I haven't. Overall, Pokemon Go is a fun diversion that is at least somewhat deeper than it appears, having been expertly pared down to represent Pokemon's essence in a more mobile-friendly format. It relies much more on social aspects than any traditional Pokemon game before it, but that's to be expected given its emphasis on real-world locations. Though the option is most certainly there, I've honestly seen no pressure as a casual player to dump any amount of real-life money into the game, and that's a great thing. I will say though, I wonder if this game will end up being more or less a fad, or if it will survive like the original games have. Personally, if I'm not out and about, I have no real reason to have Pokemon Go opened. In addition, I try to avoid opening the game in crowded or unsafe places such as a grocery store or a restaurant, and this limits the amount of time I actually play the game severely. For this reason, I worry it'll end up being a case of out of sight, out of mind, and thusly forgotten. But that all remains to be seen. But for now, I feel this game might have even warmed my Grinchy heart at least a little to a franchise I had began to grow cold to. But now if you'll excuse me, there's a Blastoise right down the road and I don't want it to disappear. That is, if I can get this darn game to log in. Hey guys, thanks for watching my video. If you'd like to see more, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you'd like to see my last video on the Sega Genesis cult classic ToeJam and Earl, you can check that out by clicking right here. Lastly, if you want to be up to date with my channel, feel free to like me on Facebook or follow me on Twitter.